Hello, my name is Eric. I'm a software engineer, and this is another entry in my Learning Out Loud video series where I take a look at past or current projects and talk about the code that makes them work. Today we're taking another look at the Kanban task tracker project, a front-end mentor project, and we've got more functionality built out here. So we have our tasks that we can look at. We can check and uncheck our subtasks, and our count of completed tasks is changing. We have the ability to move our tasks between columns, which we looked at in the last video where we talked about Immer and how that helps make our state, our deeply nested object, much easier to work with. And now we have this little plus button working where we can open up a modal to enter a new task to add to our board. So we can do our title, test title, this is a test description, and then we can add our subtasks as we need, and each one has a little delete button which we can test and see only deletes the one that we click on, so that's working correctly. We can select where we want this thing to live when we first create the task. So if I put this in doing and I hit create task, now we have down here, this is a test title task that we created with our test description, and this is functioning as everything else functions. So I want to take a look at that today and see how we set that up so we are making our new tasks. So let's close this out. We're going to minimize this window, and we're going to take a look at some of the code. So what we're looking at now is the app.tsx file, which is the highest level of my application. And we've got in this part, the things that matter right now are our nav bar, which is where our plus button lives in the nav bar. But we also have our new task modal, which actually lives in this board view component. So in order to have this modal appear and disappear, I'm using the same kind of background that I was using on the other modals that pop up, which is just fixed, and once you click on it, it adjusts a state for that particular component to say if it's viewable or not viewable. So this state of this component lives here in the app, show add task. So we can pass it both to our nav bar, where we have, if we scroll this over, show add task, and we can pass it to our board view component. So that's where that is living. But let's actually go look at the board view component, because this is where things get much more interesting. So we pass through to our task modal. We still have our show add task, so we can adjust that visibility. And we're sending in the column names, which is another variable that we have previously declared, and add new task, right? Which add new task is a function that lives right here, which we'll look at toward the end, which is another Immer function, so that's in another file, where we send over our board data, board index, and the new task that we make. So let's go look at how we actually create that new task using this form that we have created over here. So if we go to our task modal, and I'm going to close this, and we will wrap our text around here. So when we first made this, I didn't really spend too much time looking at this particular modal. I may have done it in the first video of this particular project, but it was just a static component with just data that we just typed out in there, nothing crazy. This is basically the original code unchanged, besides the now functions that we have in here and some of the information that we pass in and values and things like that. But let's look at the actual functionality that we created here, our specific functions and our objects that we create. So we have this broken out into a few different sections. First, we'll look at the actual main task object. So if we recall from previous episodes here of this project, we have our JSON data file, which is a very large object. But the thing that we're really working with here, our our tasks. Here's an example of a task object, which has the main bulk of our task, title, description, status, and we can start to see those things over here, title, description, status. And then it has a subtask array, and each subtask is its own object, right? So let's first look at this bulk right here, title, description, status. That's kind of the easiest thing to work with. So we start with state, and our state is a new task, we just called it. And in that, we have our type declared using TypeScript of tasks, which I have tasks as a type living in another file of my I call them interface. And you can see if I highlight here, you can see it says title, description, status, and subtask. All these are optional just because I'm not using all of them all of the time. And if they weren't declared as optional with that question mark, TypeScript would get mad at me. So we have that declared here, and we make a new object with title, the blank string, description with a blank string, and status. We're passing in column names. What column names is doing is it's just looking at whatever columns we have within that particular board, and it's just creating an array out of them and sending that data over here. So we're defaulting this to the first column. Whatever that column is, in our case here, it is to do. So this will default with the status of to do. Then we're going to edit that task, right? So whenever we actually start typing in here, like if I start typing, test title 2, what's happening here is if we go look at the title label with the input, on change, we pass in the event, and we call our edit new task function, and we pass that function the event, right? With that event, we get a whole bunch of different things we can pass through. The things that we really care about are e.target.name and e.target.value. So what name is doing for us, in this case, it's sending along the name of this particular input, which is title, and the value of whatever we're typing into that field, which is also tied to new task.title, just so we can show the changes if we change that object. But regardless, the title, the name is very important for us, because what this allows us to do is when we declare name here, we're going to just put it in its own variable just for readability. When we make a new copy of this object, which we'll talk about in a second as well, we can just throw our name variable in here. So now regardless of if it's coming from title or if it's coming from description, so if we look at our description, which is a text area, has the name of description. So now we know what field we're editing without having to make different functions for each particular field. So once that's passed in here, we make the copy of the new object, which we talked about last time with Immer. We're not using Immer in this particular case because this object is much more simplistic to work with. It's not nested, it's just one object with a couple key value pairs here. And it says if you're passing in name of title, whatever the value is, we make a copy of the object because this is state, and state with React is immutable, so we can't just adjust the object in state. We have to make a copy of it first and then adjust that object. So we pass in all the previous values in new task, and then whatever name is, in this case if we're typing in description, name is description. When we pass in the copy with the spread syntax, everything that is previously here, this would be copied over into our copied object, and then description would be overwritten with description and whatever our new value is. So if let's look at some of this, right? Let's console.log this, so let's go look at copy. So we'll open up our inspector here. And actually, let's get out of phone view. We can look at that a little bit later. And if we go to the console, let's start over here and blank our items out here. So you can see as I start typing in, we're logging our object here, which right now just has a letter T in title. Description is blank, status is to do. And as I continue to type in my title, it's sending back that data of whatever I'm typing in, overwriting title each time it makes that copy. And then it sends copy into set new task, replacing the previous state, right? We know that React will update state when it's an object or an array, you have to pass in a new version of that object or array in order to see your updates in React. Same thing with description. Using the same exact function, we're passing in the description name. Let's also look at, why not, let's look at console.log, let's look at E. So as soon as I type anything, we see here's our object. Let's bring this up a little bit higher. We see here's our object that has the adjustments we have made, and here's our event object that we're passing in, and here's target, and we see value lives in there, and if we scroll down we have e.target.name, and we see name there is description. So that's how all that is functioning. And like I said, we pass that back to the new task. Task is overwritten, and our object in state is updated. Excellent. So now we've got that working. If you've ever built out a form in React, this is the way you make that work. You may have, if you were just starting to learn React, like I did in the past, you may have put every single input field as its own state, which is just a lot extra to work with, making that an object and using your spread syntax and updating that object each time is a little less code to deal with and hopefully a little less error prone. So we've got that. We can take our console.logs out of there. And then we have change task status. So I had to do this one a little bit differently rather than pass it into the same function. So we have our current status selection box here. And if you recall from a previous video or even earlier in this video where we looked at the ability to move tasks from one column to another, if I take this and move it to doing, we see that dropped down here. This whole selection box is the same component as this. We made one component and we're just reusing it in two different places. So let's go look at that component. Let's see what it's all about. So if we look at status select, which is our component here, you can see on the select element here, we have an onChange, which again, we're passing that event into a function called change task status, and we're passing e.target.value, which we just looked at before. We know we have a value on there. Whatever we select becomes the value. We pass that value over to change task status. When we're doing this to change a task from one column to another, I'm using the same named function. All right, so let's go look at task view card. So if we go down to the status select here, that component in this task view card component, right, when we're changing this, here's change, whoops, here is the change task status function that we pass into status select, and here, change task status, we pass in that new status as a string, doing, to do, done, whatever it is, and use that with other variables, which we've looked at in a previous video, and send that to our function with Immer and update the whole gigantic nested state object, and that moves over. So I didn't want to have to make a whole new function to reuse that component. So instead what we do, in our task modal now, we make a new task, this, using that same component. We're using the same function name, change task status, so I can send that into my status select using the same function name, change task status, and I'm receiving the same data, new status, as a string, and I'm doing the same kind of thing here as we're doing up here in edit task. I'm creating a copy of our new task using my spread syntax, and I'm overriding status with whatever the new status is, and then sending our copy back into our setter function and updating the state. So I was really happy with that one because I just, having reusable components and not having to do too many different functions to make that stuff work, this was just a lot of fun for me to put together and figure out. So that's how we're making the bulk of the new tasks, right? We looked at title, description, and status. So let's go back and let's look at our JSON file. And we know in here, we've got now our title, description, and status. But then we have subtask. And subtask is an array of objects, right? So we know that each subtask is going to be its own individual object living within an array. So in order to accomplish that, we've got a whole different state within this modal for our subtasks. So here we have const new subtask and set new subtask, our setter function and our state. And we have this as the subtask array, right? I have subtask again in that other file as a type, and you can see the things here are just a title and is completed. Those are the only two things that exist on a subtask in the data we're working with. And we start this off as a blank array, nothing in it whatsoever. We have an add subtask function here where, let's go down and see where that actually lives. We have a button here that says add subtask. This is our add new subtask button. So whenever we click this, we're going to call the add subtask function. And what this is going to do for us is, let's get rid of this so we get some more visibility. It's first going to, just as we did before, copy our current subtask array, whatever that is, with our spread syntax. And then we're going to add a new object here. Whether other objects exist or not, it doesn't matter. This is a new object that we're creating within this function. And we're adding on whatever the title is, and in this case we're keeping it blank title to start, and is completed defaults to false, right? You're not going to add a subtask that is completed already. We're just going to leave that as false. And then we pass our subtask copy to the subtask setter, right? So all this does is I click this button, and we have created a new object that we push onto that subtask state, that array. So we can click this as many times as we want, and every time we're just making a new object. And then we can delete that same thing. We'll look at the delete in a second as well. So before we do anything, let's look again like we did before, console.log, not call names. Console.log, subtask copy. Let's take a look. We've got our console. Let's clear some of this out. We click. Here's our object, our array, with a blank title is completed false. We click it again. Here's our array that we're seeing, our subtask copy array. Two objects, both blank titles, is completed false. And every time we click, we just continue to add on to that array by using our spread, put a new object there, repeat. Okay, that's excellent. What about removing? So we've got our next function here. I'll save us from going back down into the code. If we click on this button, we're calling this remove subtask function. And what this does for us is, again, this is copying our subtask state. So once we click this, it's copying this whole array into a new variable we call copy. And then we're just going to use a array method. We're using splice in this case. We're saying copy.splice, and we're going to splice out whatever index we're going to receive, which we pass in index. We will look at that in a second. And we're just removing one object. And then from that, we can paste that in or send that back to our setter function. So we're mapping out these subtasks. We can see we have our new subtask array here that we have our state.map, and for each item we're returning this entire thing, which is our input and our button to delete, and we're also passing an index. So every single one of these inputs knows its index number within our subtask array. So when we call that function, we pass back that index number so we know exactly which specific one we're removing, right? So let's take a look at that. And I still have my console.log up here, right? So we can look at, we add a new task. We'll look at this really quickly, this edit subtask, because it's the exact same thing we're doing with edit, title, description, and the status here. Well, not technically the status, but the title and description, where we basically send back the title and value, right? So we're editing the same exact way. So we're typing our information in here. Let's show the one we put in. We're going to make our adjustments. We add a new subtask, right? We can see we've got that one we typed into. This is blank. We're making our adjustments. We'll add a new subtask. We can see our array here. So if I delete this one that says tests, this is the second item in this array, or the first index. So it's going to pass back that index number so it knows which one to splice out of the array copy that we're making. And that's how we remove that particular item. Cool. Awesome. Great. How do we actually add this thing to the whole board once we're done and we've got our subtasks created and our main task created? So at this point, if you've been following along and you know we're looking at a gigantic object here and we're saying, all right, Eric, you've got your task object created, but so far you've got your title, description, and status as one piece of state and your subtask array as a different piece of state, but we need those to be merged together in order for them to live within this board. Cool. Easy enough for us to do, right? Within our task modal. We have a create task function down here. So once I click on this, let's get this out of here, this create task button, it calls a create task function, where we're going to say let final task equal whatever our new task is, so our title, description, and status. Again, we're using our spread syntax because we're going to create a copy of that particular object. We're doing, we're also creating a copy of our final subtasks. I guess I technically don't need to in this case, but we're doing it here anyway. And then final task dot subtasks. Oh, excuse me. So we're calling final tasks dot subtasks. So the blank array, or would be a blank array, we're saying equals final subtask. So we're basically just using our standard object dot notation to put our subtask array into a subtasks key value pair, right? Subtask doesn't exist on this up here. We don't have this created. Subtask isn't created blank, it's not initialized at any point until we actually call this particular function where we add subtasks to our object, and then we put our final subtask array into that. And then we're going to pass this over to add new task, which is a function that lives in Immer. And then the return we're going to send back to our setter function. So add new task, excuse me, actually lives, we looked at that already, lives in the board view, right? So board view add new task lives here. We pass the task, new task that we created. We say let result equal add new task, where we send the board data, the board index that we're currently on, the new task that we created, and then we go over to the Immer file that we have set up, where we're going to go look at add task. And here's our add task function with Immer, which again we looked at previously using Immer with produce, which makes this very easy for us. We have our board data and our draft that we're going to be adjusting. We find a columns array, and we find a column index. We did this in another function as well, which basically says we need to find the appropriate column array to put this in based on, we're passing a new task into this function, based on the status of that task. So whether that's to do, doing, done, or whatever name of whatever board column that we're in, we find the column, the appropriate column to push this into. Then we do drafts.board of board index of column index dot tasks dot push, and we push in our entire new task. So then we return our updated board, send that back over to the board view, which keeps closing on me. And sorry, that's board list. Board view, which updates with the result. So a decent amount of data passing back and forth. But this was another good example of understanding our data and how the objects and arrays exist, how we create and combine all that data, and how we push that back to our large nested object using Immer to get this all to function correctly. So this is where we're at with this. Very happy again with how this whole project is working out. And I do have to say that spending extra time studying data structures and algorithms has really helped me handle these types of operations way more easily than I did in the past when I was first learning all about objects and arrays and trying to make forms and updating forms in React and handling data. So as much as it might not seem like front-end development and computer science methodology or data structure and algorithms go hand in hand, take the time to study them because they will definitely enhance your ability to solve problems when it comes to large data structures, moving data around or creating new data, and also figuring out and solving bugs. This video is a lot longer than I planned on it being, but hopefully this was interesting to follow along with. If you have any questions, please let me know, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.